Okay. Very good. Let us start. Distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen in the audience here in this room and elsewhere following this event on live stream, dear colleagues. Good afternoon to all of you and a warm welcome to this high-level panel at the 15th Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. This panel is hosted by the European Commissioner for Agriculture, Janusz Wojciechowski. Thank you, Commissioner, for being the panel's host and a panel member for the 4th time already. Right up front, very, very short housekeeping announcements. They concern interpretation. You have 2 columns to the left and to the right where you can identify the languages into which and from which interpretation is possible. That is English, French, German, Polish, Arabic, Chinese, Russian, and Spanish. It is very easy to find the right channel on your headsets if you need to, and it is also easy to choose the proper language on the screen when you are following this event on a live stream. The title of this year's high-level panel is Agriculture in the New Normal, Future-Proofing Food Systems for a Changing World. And yes, the world has changed considerably since we met for the last time 1 year ago. Under this wide subject that I've just presented, we will address 3 topics. The first, current and future measures to improve the resilience of agri-food supply chains to sudden systemic shocks. Second, the long-term challenge for agriculture of mitigating and adapting to climate change. And third, the role of agriculture in preserving the Earth's ecosystems and biodiversity. Each of these 3 topics could easily fill this panel's duration by itself. So touching all 3 of them in a meaningful way in a bit more than 1 hour only is quite a challenge. But I am nonetheless sure that we will have a very interesting and enriching panel ahead of us. Allow me briefly to introduce the panel members. I would have loved to start with the Albanian Minister of Agriculture, Mrs. Krivcha. She's there, thank God. Because I thought you had gone lost forever. So she's being cabled up so that we can hear her. Almost done. Almost. Just give me that second because I wouldn't want... Yeah, there she comes. No, this way. I'm so relieved that you are here. Come on.
Apologies, thank you. Hello, greetings. Hello, Commissioner.
Hello, Minister.
Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Brilliant, have a seat. So, I welcome Frida Krivcha, the Albanian Minister of Agriculture. Mrs. Krivcha has extensive experience in agriculture until her nomination as minister in December 2021. She was the Director General of the Albanian Agency for Agriculture and Rural Development, ARDA, a function in which we have met in Tirana, which is the ARDA being in charge of the management of the EU pre-accession funds for Albania. I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm glad that you are actually sitting next to the Commissioner. I'm delighted to be able to greet the Minister of Agriculture of Australia, Mr. Murray Watt, to the extreme right here. As we all know, Australia is an agricultural superpower and one that faces various challenges, not only environmental, as we have been learning from the press very recently. In the light of this, we are super interested to hear your contributions. Minister, thank you for having joined us. A heartfelt welcome to Jean-Marie Pogam. Mr. Pogam is Director General of the World Trade Organization in Geneva and looks back onto a long career in a variety of high-level functions, both in France and elsewhere. Welcome to you, and thank you for being with us. It is with great pleasure that, as in the previous 3 panels, I announce the presence of Johan Joos Winnen, as I keep saying, a giant in agricultural economics. He used to teach and research at the Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium. And since the beginning of 2020, he is the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, the IFPRI, in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us again and for contributing to our discussion. For each subject, you will see that in a moment, Professor Swinnen will make introductory remarks, a pitch, as it were, to open the subject, and then you, the panelists, may react to what he has said and expand on it. And I shall not forget myself. My name is Peter Bader. I'm a retired official of DG Agriculture and Rural Development of the European Commission, and as you may easily guess, it is my job to navigate us through this event. But enough from my side for the moment. I would very much like to give the floor to our host, to Commissioner Wojciechowski, for his welcome and his opening words. Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Peter. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this high-level panel. I'm pleased to continue the tradition on annual discussion panel hosted by the European Union at the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. I'm glad that we can see each other in person once again after 2 years of virtual meetings. In particular, I would like to extend a warm welcome to my fellow panelists who have kindly accepted our invitation to take part today. The German Ministry of Agriculture has selected a very important topic for this year's forum, the global response to the crisis facing the world food system. I look forward to discussing this topic with you today. Our first discussion will focus on how we can make agri-food supply chains more resilient against systemic shocks such as pandemic, trade disputes and military conflicts. On this note, I now hand over to Professor Swinnen for his introductory remarks.
Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and thanks very much for the EU Commission and the Commissioner for inviting me. It's great to be in Berlin. I was often in Berlin in the 1990s when we studied the transition of the old system to the new system from the East to West Europe. And then my daughter studied in Berlin. I came often a couple of years ago, and now it's great to be back here. As Peter mentioned, we have big themes to discuss today, so the challenge is to say something substantive, yet in a very short time, in a few minutes, as an introduction to each of the 3 questions. So the first question is, how do you make agri-food supply chains more resilient against systemic shocks such as pandemics, trade disputes, and conflicts? So here is a slide which I think many of you know the left slide well, which is the evolution of grain prices over the past couple of years, and you see the green line is rice, okay, that has been less affected by the Ukraine war, but the other prices are basically maize and wheat, and you've seen there's been huge shocks to large volatility in these grain markets. Actually, if we go back for the last 20 years, okay, what you will see is very different than from the 20 years before. Remember 2007, 2008, we had a big increase in food prices, and we talked about the price shock in the world. Shock was because it was unexpected. Okay, the normal was relatively stable price on world markets and suddenly spikes. What we see now over the last 20 years is that the normal is volatility. Prices going up and down, and this is just one illustration of a longer trend, if you want. We also know that it is not just conflicts that are the fact, and we have a lot of conflicts all through the world. It's not just in Ukraine, there were conflicts in Egypt, not in Egypt, in Ethiopia, for example, Myanmar, etc. Climate change obviously plays an important role, and then COVID as well. And so this table on the right-hand side shows how many people in the world experience extreme food insecurity. So this is not your regular hunger, this is extreme food insecurity, food crisis, and you see these are big numbers caused by these 3 different factors. And so this comes from the Food Crisis Report, which comes out every year now. And we see conflict and security up to 140 million people in 2021. Economic shock, some of them due to COVID, 40 to 30 million. I mean, these are really large numbers. So we are in very difficult times. Let's take a look at our agri-food supply chains. If we look at across the world, then we've seen they have undergone tremendous transformation over the last 25 years, particularly in low and middle income countries. We have seen something, people have called it the supermarket revolution. Massive investments by often Western companies, but not always, sometimes also local companies like in India and China, which have revolutionized the whole food system, making a much more modern supply chains in many of these countries. What we see now with COVID and the conflict, etc., is we've seen significant disruption of these supply chains, but there's been a lot of heterogeneity, depending on whether they were labor-intensive or capital-intensive, whether they were large-scale, small-scale companies involved, short and long-run staples versus perishable crops was very different. And I'm sure all of you have seen in the media lots of stories about these disruptions. What we have seen, though, okay, if we look back, for example, on COVID, is that these supply chains have been more resilient than we thought initially. Okay? And so that has been due to a number of innovations, particularly technological innovation. We've seen a big growth of digital technology in many of the supply chains, also in middle-income countries especially, even in e-commerce showing up in the poorest countries in the world. And also managerial innovations, institutional innovation in these supplies to deal with these shocks. And in a way, this is, it's a difficult situation, but it's also promising going forward that we are able to deal with them, to organize them, to introduce technology, to make them resilient. It's not only external shocks, but here is what we've seen in each of these crises, that governments have intervened and introduced export barriers during these crises. Okay, this is from the 2007 crisis, the Ukraine crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis now. And so these are the number of countries in the world introducing export constraints of food. Okay, and so of course this contributes to the volatility in the world. This contributes to the vulnerability of countries that are importing these foods. So, what can we do about this? How to enhance resilience? I have actually listed here 4 different types of measures. So we have to think in terms of categories of package of measures that we can do. One, the easiest, not the easiest one, but actually the most obvious one is make sure the shocks are not happening. Okay? So limit them, the frequency, the magnitude, for example, climate mitigation measures clearly fit into this category. The second one is if the shocks are going to come, try to inform yourself about it, try to anticipate them. This is where early warning systems have a role, digital technologies, mobile phones, etc., to inform people about it, to measure them, to predict them. Third one is, if they come, have measures to absorb the shocks. So this is where roles where insurance policies, access to capital, social safety nets can play a very important role for different agents in the supply chains. And then the last point is what we see typically is that shocks are hitting the poorest in our society hardest. Okay? So the issue of inclusion, of taking care of our poorest people is part of this resilience strategy. So let me leave it at that as introduction, and I put the question back up. Peter.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to turn to you, Minister Krivcha, first. What we've heard from Professor Swinen on the first topic, what is your point of view in particular, but maybe not only from the Albanian point of view? Has the Albanian agri-food supply chain suffered shocks? And if so, what was your government's response to that?
First of all, thank you, Commissioner, for having me on this high-level panel. It's much appreciated, and I'm honored. Thank you to everyone. Apologies for coming late. It was a crashing moment with the visit of the minister in the previous in the fair. What happened in Albania? What did we see? I would like to give you a little bit of an outlook of what Albania agriculture sector looks like, just very briefly. It's a small country in size, but the GDP of agriculture is roughly around 18%, so it's pretty high. About a third of our population is employed in agriculture, so it's very important. in that regard. We have a heavy and highly oriented agriculture in cultures that we have a competitive advantage because of our wonderful positioning geographically. We are next to Italy, next to Greece, in the heart of the Western Balkans position. Beautiful microclimate, biodiversity, good climate conditions, but we're orienting fruits, vegetables, medicinal plants, fisheries, basically taking advantage of our natural resources. We have a very ambitious goal in exports of fruits and vegetables, again, medicinal plants. So in the beginning of the year 2022, when the shocks started to hit the system, obviously we did not have any early warning systems, as previously mentioned. It was very hard to predict what really happened. Keep in mind that budgets for agriculture are approved 4 or 5 months prior to what happened. So we started looking at countries actually going on protectionistic policies, going through issues of closing the borders. Now, Albania is a country that, yes, is producing agriculture, but is importing heavily on wheat, on sugar, on oil, on other staple products, commodities. So we were highly impacted by several countries that were affected by the war. So we were importing roughly around 40% of our wheat needs from Ukraine. And that in itself posed a huge risk to the supplying of the country with basic food, basically. What did we do? Our government and the leaders of 3 countries, Macedonia, Serbia, and Albania, they have taken on a political initiative to increase cooperation on a sort of a single market approach amongst each other, to remove barriers, to remove administrative controls, to recognize institutions of food safety, of phytosanitary certificates, veterinary certificates. So this was done a little bit prior to what we started seeing, but that in itself really helped us to further address through an agreement we had with Serbia, which was and is still an exporter of wheat for us. So we could basically transport our imports and needs for imports for wheat and for corn, for our animal feeds from other countries, from the countries that were able to, through this agreement, to satisfy the needs that we had for these imports. So basically the lessons that I would have, my take basically from last year, is first, we were able to close the year with an increase of around 18% of exports for our agricultural products. So all in all, even though we had a very high-risk year in agriculture, through the measures that we put in place, we tripled the budget support to our farmers last year in order to support them for the increased cost of production. We also, as I said, had an agreement to release exports and imports of food, so remove trade barriers that we see happening. So my take basically is that food sovereignty, although it seems to be solutions, oftentimes is a dangerous temptation. And internal resilience is often built and strengthened by cooperation and engagement of externality.
Okay, thank you very much. The point that you mentioned, the cooperation of Albania with neighboring countries in order to ease crisis, I think that is a very good, a very positive approach. Thank you very much for that, because I was not aware.
It's okay, I was just going to add that as a result of this increased cooperation, our trade balance among these 3 countries increased by 24% only last year.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Pogam, over to you, please. As Professor Swinton has said, the situation is difficult and systemic shocks to the agri-food supply chain disturb the economy in general. From the angle of the World Trade Organization, what would you like to share with us in this respect?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your invitation. Good afternoon, ministers and everyone. I think that since the beginning of the century, we have been undergoing three major crises. And from each one of them, we learned a lesson which made us more resilient and including to face that one. The first one was 2008, where we learned the value of transparency. Transparency in the behaviors, in the trade behaviors of different countries. It's very important because it helps control kind of panic reactions, it helps control speculation, and it helps limit protectionist kind of chain reaction. And this is when the WTO started its monitoring work, which has been feeding the trade policies of our members since then. And also the G20 created the AMIS, Agricultural Market Information System, for the same purpose. Of transparency is the first element to absorb shock. The second crisis was the COVID one. And then we had at the beginning of this crisis this temptation of taking export restriction, because it is fully allowed in our textbook in the WTO. When you have a crisis, you can take restrictive measures to protect your population for health good and food. But the problem is that if everyone does that, you just worsen the problem. It's a game theory thing. So you have to convince all the participants that they would be better off by keeping the market open. And this openness of market is the second element to absorb those shocks. And at that time, the G20 came with a language which was very interesting. It was a suggestion to refrain from export restriction and to have trade measures be proportionate, transparent, targeted, and reversible. And at the beginning of the food crisis generated partly by the situation in Ukraine, we used in the WTO the same language to help control the risk of proliferation of trade restriction. And in both cases, it worked relatively well. For the COVID situation, it worked quite well because you saw a big resilience of health trade, health product trade, and food trade. And for the on your slide, it was visible. You saw that we could keep under control the level of trade restriction, and at the end of the day, it helps also alleviate the pressure on prices. The third lesson came with the war in Ukraine, which is that even in the worst possible international situation, it's important to try as possible to keep multilateral cooperation channel open. And there are two examples of that which have been successful this year. The first one is certainly the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is a corridor in the Black Sea which has been negotiated through the auspices of the UN Secretary General. The second one has been certainly also our trade ministerial conference, MC12 in the WTO, where we had quite a landmark agreement on food security, on the elimination of trade restriction to the World Food Programme. So these are the elements which can help absorb at least or limit the shocks: transparency, keeping market openness, and keeping channels of cooperation open to the extent possible. And I think for the moment, we are better off than we were 6 months ago because of those three elements. We are not off the hook, of course, but these are the recommendations.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that was a brilliant overview over strategies to combat the negative consequences of such shocks. Thank you very much. Over to you, Minister Watt. From the Australian perspective, what does it take to make agri-food chains more resilient against such systemic shocks, if Australia has at all experienced them?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because we have. And I was just thinking about the fact, obviously, Australia is a very long way from where we are now, but even though we're on the other side of the world, we have still experienced a number of the supply shocks for exactly the same reasons as you have here in Europe and in other parts of the world. And can I also thank the Commissioner for the invitation to participate in today's panel. It's probably good that I follow on from what's just been said, because for Australia, if there's one thing that we see as central to solving these supply chain shocks and crises, it is continuing to push for open and freer trade. Australia has obviously been a member of the Cairns Group for a long time, has had a long history of advocating for open trade in the WTO and a range of other fora. And we think that now more than ever is the time that the world needs to be embracing freer and open trade as a solution to some of these supply chain shocks. From our point of view, encouraging that kind of freer and open trade is a way of sharing the risks that arise around weather, around conflict and other supply chain interruptions across the world, rather than closing those borders and actually making ourselves more vulnerable to those kinds of shocks. So in Australian terms, you'd probably be aware we're a net exporter in a very big way of agricultural product. About 70% of our agricultural product is exported to the world. So we haven't really had the food security problems that a number of other countries have had, but the way it's impacted on us is very much in the way of inputs and input costs. So in many parts of our country, our farmers are getting quite good prices at the moment due to climatic and other reasons, but they're paying very high prices for fertilisers, for fuels, and a lot of those things are a direct result of the conflict that we're seeing on the other side of the world. So it definitely hits home. But yeah, if there's one thing that we're wanting to do, it's to take that opportunity to advance that agenda around open and freer trade. There's obviously a lot of research available that shows that freer and open trade delivers much more stable trade, much more stable food supply, better prices for farmers, better prices for consumers as well. And I think more than ever now is the time that we need to be acting on it. I thought I should just mention, though, that we're not just preaching to the rest of the world about what we think should be happening. We are trying to follow this at home as well. We've formed a number of partnerships with other countries in our regions to really actually start implementing freer trade in our own relationships, in the way we operate between each other. And also, just to pick up on something that Johan said, we're really trying to improve the digitisation of our trade to make the experience a lot more smooth for importers and exporters. And in addition to that, you're probably aware biosecurity is an extremely important issue for Australian agriculture. We have the good fortune of being an island continent, so to some extent that moat that sits around Australia in every direction is a bit of a guard against biosecurity, but we're obviously facing more and bigger threats from a biosecurity perspective, but we're trying to streamline a lot of the way that we take those precautions so that they don't inadvertently end up being trade barriers when they're not actually justified. So on the externals, we're advocating for freer trade, and we're also trying to implement it much more in our domestic agenda as well.
Super, thank you very much. Perfectly clear. Commissioner Wojciechowski, would you explain to us now the strategy, the policy of the European Commission in this very difficult situation?
Yes, of course. 3 years ago, when we were at the Green Woche, Green Week in Berlin, before this crisis, nobody was expecting that how difficult time will be in the next 3 years. And COVID and next the Russian aggression against Ukraine creates the challenges for our food system. The first observation is that thanks to our farmers, the food security was ensured everywhere in each corner of the European Union all time. And European Union increased the export of food, increased contribution into food security at the global level. But there are some lessons from this crisis situation. But maybe some short reflection that we had also the long-term problem before this crisis. Now we have the results of the agricultural census made from in all member states in European Union, and we can compare the situation in agriculture 2010-2020, and the first concern that we lost 3 million farms during 1 decade. 3 million farms in European Union. It was 12 million farms in 2010 and only 9 million in 2020, which means that we lose 800 farms per day 800 farms. Probably during our debate, maybe 40, 50 farmers will decide to stop farming. The average age of the farmers was increased during 1 decade from 55.5 years to 57. The problem of lack of generational renewal. They are huge challenges to incentivize people to be a farmer, to continue farming. I hope that the reformed common agricultural policy, stronger support for small farms, small farmers, for young farmers, eco schemes which are available also especially for the small and medium-sized family farmers, that this negative process will be stopped. We hope this is our response for the long-term future. But the crisis situation, yes, these 3 years it was all time the functioning in crisis for our farmers and crisis management for the European Commission. At the beginning of the crisis, COVID crisis, the first problem was the blockade of the borders, difficult with transport of goods, of agricultural products, and also the workers, the movement of workers, lack of movement of workers, seasonal workers. Also, it was challenged. We solved these problems very with cooperation of member states. Also, there was some initiatives to block export, the cereals export. Reaction Commission was very concrete, very strong. That open trade is valued. I fully agree with the colleagues. That open trade is one of the instruments to ensure the food security and to react in the crisis situation, not to block the borders. And the main lesson is that we need to strengthen our crisis management instruments. Because what we can do during this crisis situation, of course, we used crisis reserve, first time, which we have in the CAP budget. We derogated, there was derogation, some restrictions for farmers reducing production, like non-productive areas, like mandatory crop rotation, which is important in long term, that's for the sustainable agriculture, but in the short term, we have to use all opportunities to increase production when there is risk for the food security. But in the future, we have to strengthen the instruments of crisis management at the European level. Because now we say that we opened also the state aid framework. Okay, because it's necessary to allow for the member states to use state aid. Now there is a maximum amount, possible amount of the state aid is 250,000 euro per individual farm. But we know that this is not the solution. This is not it should be, now there is no other option, but in the future we should have instrument for crisis management on the European level. We have common agriculture policy, common market. We need also the stronger crisis management instrument in the future common agriculture policy. It will be my recommendation during the review of the common agriculture policy and for the first proposal for CAP after 2027 to strengthen the crisis management instrument at the European level. This is very very important. And the last remark that common agriculture policy budget is now for the 5 years. According to the new strategic plans, we will spend 264 billion euro. This is big amount, but this is almost just about 0.4% of the European Union GDP. To ensure food security, to ensure the environmental and climate security, because agriculture is also responsible for that, many new obligations for the farmers. in the long perspective, it is not enough. And to strengthen the agriculture budget, common agriculture policy budget, is also the challenge, and we should give answer for this challenge in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner. I think that was an excellent contribution to this subject, and you will all agree with me that we could continue on this subject for the next 3 hours, but unfortunately we cannot. We must turn to our second subject now, which is the long-term challenge of mitigating and adapting to climate change in relation to agriculture. So let us hear the introductory remarks of Professor Swinnan on that.
Thank you, Peter. Again, a theme where we could not spend the entire session on, but probably the entire day in different sessions, so it's a very broad time. So I'm just going to, the Commission already mentioned also short-term crises and long-term trends. Let me look at one long-term trend here as an introduction thing. So we said the slide on the left shows the increase of the deviation from normal, if you want, in terms of climate change as it is measured by climatologists, and which really picked up after 2010, 2015. What we see on the right-hand panel, these are data from FAO, is the evolution of hunger in the world, malnutrition, okay? And so what we see there is a very worrying trend, and this is a long run, and this started before the crisis, before COVID and before the Ukraine crisis. So we see that in the middle of the last decade, around 2015, this decline, which was a massive improvement of human welfare over the last 20 years, or the 20 years before that, where we saw big declines in malnutrition, declines in hunger, stopped. And so the numbers have gone up both as a percentage of the world population and in actual numbers even stronger. And so this is a very worrying trend. And of course the current crises are contributing to that. That's why it's going up even rapidly before that. If we look at malnutrition more broadly defined in terms of healthy diets, micronutrient deficiencies, and also obesity increasingly, the numbers are much bigger. I mean, we're not talking about 800 million people, we're talking about 2 billion and 3 billion people. So this is lots of challenges to be dealt with. We know that agriculture, the relationship between food systems or agriculture and climate change is in both directions. So obviously agriculture and food systems are very strongly affected by climate change, but at the same time we know now that they are a very important contributor to climate change as well. So food systems, pretty broadly, contribute roughly 1/3 of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, which is a lot. Agriculture, forestry, and land use, other land uses, AFOLU is it usually referred to, about 20%. And what we also seen is that the trend is actually particularly stronger, if you want, in the developing world, but that includes, for example, China is here classified as developing, so this is really not the poorest countries, and this is growing, so lots of things to do. This is very brief, of course, on the mitigation, the adaptation side. I think on the mitigation, because it's such a big contributor, that also creates a big opportunity, because that means if we can do something in agriculture and food system, we can have a big impact there. Okay, so the challenge is the opportunity at the same time, and so in a way, so agricultural and forestry and other land use is the only economic sector which has a serious potential to become a net emission sink, okay, to really contribute to a reduction of greenhouse gas rather than slowing down, okay, and I think that's a major opportunity there. On adaptation, I'm not going to go in detail here. I think what we've seen from COVID-19 that our food systems have been adaptive. A lot of changes have taken place on a very short time, and that also should signal that we can make changes if we want, okay? And the matter is how to give the incentives and how to create the environment to make that possible. This is my last slide on this. I've just listed up a couple of points in terms of policies. Obviously, I don't have time to go in detail through them. But they are, I mean, the enabling of the policy framework, the policy environment is really crucial, okay? It basically provides the incentives for people to make changes, companies to make changes. It also should create reduce the restrictions, the constraints people have in making these changes. For example, access to capital is crucial, access to insurance systems, etc. And collaboration, I'm sure that will come back with in the panel discussion, both at the local level, but certainly also internationally, I think is very important. So these are a couple of points. I'm sure you know more. It relates to R&D. for making new technologies, incentives, security of investments. Trade is crucial, as was already mentioned, loss and waste reduction, sustainably healthy diets, inclusion again, the point also here, make sure that it's not the poorest who are suffering most from it, and finance, innovations there I think are crucial. Let me leave it at that, Peter, over to you.
Thank you for your insights, Jo. Let me give the floor first to Mr. Pogam. The impact of climate change on agriculture and agri-food chains is certainly something the WTO is monitoring. What is the WTO's state of mind when you look at that? And I'm afraid that what Jo Swinen has told us is not only encouraging.
Well, thank you. Actually, in substance, I think we have a quite clear vision of what we could do. In terms of process and how to move forward, this is a different story, and I'd like to comment on both. In substance, if the central issue is to do more with less, trade can bring something to the discussion. Of course, it's mainly an agricultural minister discussion, and it's revolved around technology, the use of resources, R&D. But what trade can do is leverage all these efforts to get some more efficient trading system by reducing the level of distortion on the market. And if you have a more efficient agricultural system, you probably consume less input for more output. And that is a first line of thought that we can have. And it's very important for mitigation. For adaptation, of course, there are two courses which can be followed. The first one is to feed the countries which will not be able to feed themselves because of climate change. And the most devastating example was that of Pakistan last year. Pakistan was a net food exporter and in a few weeks became a net food importer. So if you do not have trade to compensate for such situation, you cannot adapt. The second one is, of course, the flow of green technologies, to make a long story short, the technologies which can help improve efficiency of the agriculture and fight climate change. So the theory is quite there, and we have a lot of members who are mentioning that in a WTO context, following the line which were discussed here yesterday, for instance, about repurposing agricultural subsidies. This is one line of thought. Now, when it comes to the process, here I have a little bit of a question mark that I'd like to share with the minister, especially on the panel. When we go to, and I have the privilege to go to several agricultural ministers' meetings, and they all recognize the centrality of climate change. Developed countries, developing countries, they are relatively aligned in this recognition. The G20 has recognized it. The OECD, including with developing countries participating, has recognized it. The COP15 recently suggested the same. And we have a sort of consensus. But when it comes to the WTO, there is a lot of divergence about how do we tackle this issue of climate change in a trade context. So there is an issue of coherence here, and I'm mentioning it because the declaration that we have been working on for the consideration of ministers tomorrow has an article, 32, which says we need to align all those instruments and policies. So this is something very important to help us in the WTO move forward into how are we going to integrate those new challenges.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, I turn to you. To reconcile agriculture and climate change has been a top priority of the Common Agricultural Policy over quite some time now. Where do we stand in the European Union in this area?
Yes, that's the farmers are the first victims of the climate change because the consequences of the climate change affect farmers very much. The drought, the climate flood, the other catastrophes. These farmers are there is huge negative impact for the farmers in many regions in Europe. When we start now this year. That's 1st of January. There is we started the new Common Agricultural Policy, reformed Common Agricultural Policy with 2 years delay transition period because we should be better prepared for the new system, which is based on the national strategic plans and with the package for the climate and environment. First of all, eco schemes. 25%, minimum 25% of direct payment should be paid only for these farmers who voluntarily introduce the special friendly for the environment and climate practices like organic farming, like carbon farming, carbon sequestration, like also animal welfare is improvement over the minimum requirement standards is also treated as an eco scheme, also very important. And we will see what will be the results. I hope that we achieve positive results on the direction to make our agriculture more friendly for environment, for climate, more sustainable. But there is the other issue that we can achieve our goals only which we have the farmers. This is impossible to achieve without the farmers. I'd like to return to this problem. 57 years, the average age of the European farmer. And this is not the problem that's only because we observe it not depends from the condition of agriculture. We can observe the process that young people don't like to continue the family farming. Also in the countries where agriculture is very modern, very intensive, very productive, and also the young people don't like to be a farmer. There is many problems to solve. I think the condition of life in rural areas is very important. That we mentioned this problem in our long-term vision for rural areas, the document adopted 2021. This is a lot of proposed recommended actions on the level of the member states, regions to increase the condition of life in rural areas. This is very, very important because many people, they could be the farmer, but they don't like to live in the rural areas where the condition of life is not the same like in urban areas. This is also the question of our cohesion policy, which is also one of the two, the biggest policies, cohesion policy and common agriculture policy. In cohesion policy, according to the treaty, Article 174, according to this article, rural areas should be treated with preference. There are three types of areas should be treated with preference. Rural areas, the first, post-industrial, and outermost regions. And in the practices, not always, but generally is not respected this preference for the rural areas. To improve standards of life, condition of life on rural areas is very important. To encourage, to incentivize young people to be the farmer, and with them to make the agriculture more sustainable, more friendly for the environment, for the life. But now that we will observe the results of the reform common agriculture policy, I hope that we will see the positive results of the eco schemes of this new system to make agriculture more friendly for environment, for climate, and agriculture policy more friendly for farmers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Minister Watt, we all know Australia as down under. Recently, unfortunately, it was also land under. You've had extreme rainfall, and we all remember photos and videos on television with vast strips of land flooded. And undoubtedly, that is a consequence of climate change because Australia has not experienced that in such an extreme fashion in the past. What is your government's agenda to address problems, catastrophes actually like that?
You're right. I think, as you say, I think the whole world has seen the footage of the series of extreme weather events and disasters that we've experienced in Australia over the last few years. If you go back 5 or 6 years, we've been through a once-in-a-generation drought across our 3 biggest states, then into massive bushfires, the like of which we had never seen in Australia. And as you say, we're now seeing terrible flooding, including in a lot of our prime agricultural land. So, you know, you're probably aware there's been a big debate about climate change in Australia, as there has been in many other countries. But even for people who were holding out and trying to pretend that climate change isn't really happening, the evidence, unfortunately, is unfolding before our eyes every single day. What I thought I might just quickly do is share with you some bad news, some good news and some better news on this issue from an Australian perspective. So the bad news is, as you say, we are experiencing these impacts, and they are directly impacting on farmers and food supply in Australia. The modelling that we've undertaken in Australia says that over the last 20 years, the change in seasonal conditions as a result of climate change has reduced the average farm profitability in Australia by 23%, which is about $30,000 per farm, which is a lot for a family farm, maybe not so much for a large corporate farm, but it is directly impacting on farmers' bottom lines right now. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that because these things are happening more and more frequently, Australian farmers have really accelerated the work that they're doing to make their operations more sustainable and to adapt to this changing climate, to insulate themselves from this. And again, just to give you a couple of figures on that, our beef industry, a very large industry in Australia, mostly open grazing, unlike what happens here in Europe, our beef farmers have reduced their emissions by 58% since 2005 as a result of changes to feed and land management and agricultural practices. And we've got more farmers than ever before changing their practices around pesticide use, around fertiliser use, and a whole range of other methods to make sure that their operations are more sustainable. And I might say that obviously that's partly about preserving their profitability and making sure that their farm is good to hand on to the next generation. But Australian farmers know very well that our ongoing ability to trade with the world and have new markets open up is dependent on being able to demonstrate to the world that we have environmental best practice. And that's what we're really doing a lot of, and our farmers are leading the way. So the bad news, the good news and the even better news is that just as I say that Australian farmers have been doing a great job on this front, I'm very pleased to tell you that as a result of the change of government in Australia a few months ago, our Australian farmers are now joined by a government in Australia that is actually serious about doing something on climate change and working in partnership with farmers. What became clear to me when I became the Minister for Agriculture a few months ago was that our industry, our farmers, had got so far ahead of where our former government had been on climate change and sustainability issues, and the farmers were doing it without the support of government. And that has changed as a result of the change of government that we've seen in Australia. So you may have seen we've now legislated much stronger emissions reductions targets than what Australia has ever before, matching what our farm groups had already done, and a number of our industries have also set their own targets. So again, our livestock industry, our beef and sheep producers, they've got a target to be producing all carbon neutral product by 2030. So very ambitious targets, and frankly ahead of a lot of the rest of the world. And we're backing them up with serious investment around preparing better for future droughts. I talked before in another panel about trying to achieve a mind shift change rather than reacting to these climate events, actually preparing for them. The phrase we use is the best time to prepare for a drought is when you're not in drought. So taking action now when there's lots of rain around to make sure that people are well prepared for what's coming. We're investing heavily in innovation, particularly around feed supplements, to continue driving down methane emissions amongst our livestock producers. And also at the same time, we're introducing and strengthening a range of market-based mechanisms as well. Because obviously, if we can be assisting farmers to develop new income streams to benefit themselves by adopting even better environmental practice, then that's going to help really achieve a lot of those emissions reductions as well. The only other thing I would say, just to back in what I was saying earlier and to pick up on points that I've already made, this is also part of our trade agenda. So just as we argue in Australia that liberalisation of trade is a very good solution to food shortages and food security, we say that it's also a very good way to eliminate environmentally harmful subsidies that we see around the world. And again, I know that there's OECD research which says that there's approximately $800 billion US in agricultural subsidies around the world at the moment, about half of which is environmentally harmful. So that's part of our trade agenda as well as taking those actions at home.
Thank you very much. I think that everybody here in this room wishes your government and Australia good luck in pursuing and achieving these targets. Very good. Minister Krivchka, you have explained in your first statement that agriculture is an important sector of the Albanian economy. And clearly that sector also in Albania is threatened by climate change. What is your government's agenda in this relation?
Well, let me start by saying that it's 28,000 kilometers of territory. Albania has completely renewable energy. 100% of it is coming from water. However, we are definitely more and more exposed from the same effects of the weather, extreme weather conditions, prolonged droughts, heavy rains. Currently, as we're speaking, in the northern part of Albania, we're experiencing very heavy floods, which are certainly exposing our farmers to insecurity, to increased costs. So what we're currently doing is trying to invest heavily and to build a national strategy that approaches a tackle of these challenges by addressing them in long-term investments, basically in infrastructure, giving priority to the sustainable management of our natural resources, at the same time increasing farm resilience to climate conditions, climate factors, meaning a protection of the farmers against agricultural risk through insurance schemes or which cover definitely weather phenomena and other damage production. We also have reflected higher environmental and climate ambitions that are aligned with our political goals to become a part of the European Union member. So green agenda commitments for the Western Balkans was signed in 2020 on the Sofia Declaration, which means that we need to achieve climate neutrality of the European continent by 2050. By reducing the use of by reducing and also using efficient use of fertilizers and pesticides, and the increase of agricultural areas that are using currently organic farming, and we have concrete commitments towards that. In the Green Agenda for the Western Balkans, we aim to a mitigation of decreasing by 21% the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And there is a climate, basically an energy plan for Albania on how to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. So while we're, as I said, while we're investing heavily on encouraging protection for floods, which is in the budget of the Ministry of Agriculture in Albania, we are also designing long-term strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and integrating climate actions into all relevant actors of our public sector. In addition, we are currently implementing the EPART program, as you mentioned before, with a generous funding by the European Commission. EPART 3 was also approved by the Commission with an increased budget of 54%, for which we're thankful for. We are accrediting 5 other measures that are agro-environment measures in order to tackle exactly such problems. But in EPART 2, we have implemented roughly around 10 million euros that are exactly by the private sector that are currently investments in technology for energy saving and environmental protection. We're seeing practices in our agriculture implementations from our farmers for using biodiesel, biogas, wind photovoltaics, and other investments such as this, which are completely a novelty in the reality of Albania. So I think we're in the right path.
Very good. Fingers crossed that it works out. Now to our third and last topic, ladies and gentlemen, agriculture's role in preserving the Earth's ecosystems and biodiversity. Again, Josephine.
Thank you, Peter. Again, a very big topic, and there is some similarity here with the climate change issue, I think. I think if we look at the similarity is there that just as with climate change, that the relationship is strongly and is large, and it's bidirectional. So food systems, agriculture depend on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity for a number of reasons that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But at the same time, agriculture is at risk by having a low, biodiversity fading away or reducing very significantly. And so probably radical changes are needed in agriculture and our food system, just like with climate change, also here to preserving the biodiversity and the ecosystems. And so the relationship is actually even larger here, because on the right-hand panel, the columns refer to or show the share of agriculture in a number of indicators. Okay, for example, land use, it's about 50% of global habitable land, freshwater use, 70% of global freshwater withdrawals, eutrophication, 78% of the global ocean and freshwater pollution, and biodiversity in livestock, in animals, is even much larger. It's more than 90%. Okay, so that shows again it's the same point. Okay, it's a huge challenge. At the same time, I think it's also a huge opportunity that if you can change it, you can have a large impact on the problem, on the global problem. We see that global cropland keeps growing, so that means that it continues to grow, so more and more land is being used for agriculture, and the numbers on some of these indicators for for ecosystem degradation or biodiversity degradation are large. 33% of agricultural soils are degraded, 20% of the world's aquifers are overexploited, 60% of biodiversity loss is attributed to food production, and also in the fishery sector, the numbers are in the same order of magnitude. I'm going to here, so what's important is that agricultural grows, land use grows, I mean, in the world, but it's very regional. There's a lot of regional heterogeneity in there. And so there you see that, for example, in Western Europe, the land use is actually falling rather than increasing. And in some of the other parts in North America, it grows, but not very strong compared to, for example, in Africa, where the growth is actually very strong. And so, and this is the regional examples and the country examples there. You see Germany, and particularly, there's been significant decline. And so there's really, I'm going to leave the panel with this actually, and all of you to think about. If you want one obvious way of dealing with it, for a lot of people, is more intensification, which means you produce more food using less resources, and therefore you reduce the pressure on the land and on water, etc. Okay, and so this is intensification, and now people consider mostly sustainable intensification, where you take into account a number of factors. There's been a kind of a counter movement which has developed over the last 15 years, I would say, or 20 years, which is the agroecology vision. This is now increasingly influencing policy perspective as well, particularly in Europe, I would say. Which, I mean, and so the question is, are these substitutes, okay? Do you have to choose for one strategy, or are these complements, given that there is so much heterogeneity across the world, but also in countries, in certain regions, and can you have both dealing with some of the problems or in some regions of the problems? So I'm going to leave it at this, also to give sufficient time for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jo. I would like to turn to Commissioner Wojciechowski first. Commissioner, the European Commission has been and is very much concerned by deteriorating ecosystems and a loss of biodiversity, both in the European Union, but quite honestly also beyond the European Union. What can agriculture in a European context do to reverse these phenomena instead of contributing to them?
Yes, thank you for this question. It's partially I answered before, but maybe I will remain the main European Union action, because the list is long of these actions to improve the biodiversity protection. And first of all, one of the biggest threats to food security is biodiversity loss. For example, several important food crops rely on pollination. That is why the Common Agricultural Policy will continue to support the restoration of biodiversity. Due to its special significance, the European Union law recognizes the specific nature of agricultural land. These laws are included in the conditionality of the Common Agricultural Policy. One of its specific objectives of the new CAP is to contribute to halting and reversing biodiversity loss, enhance ecosystem services, and preserve habitats and landscapes. To meet this objective, we are monitoring indicators like the grassland butterfly index and the farmland bird index, the stock of organic carbon in cropland mineral soil, the share of high-density landscape features, the protection and rewetting of peatlands. Farmers will be supported to boost their farmland biodiversity through eco-schemes, as I said before, and rural development schemes. Two important areas being supported are forestry and organics. Forestry depends on nature. Restored, more biodiverse forestry ecosystems will be more resilient to external threats and to possibly the impacts of climate change or even natural disasters. Organic farming combines best environmental practices and preservation of natural resources, including soil, with balancing present and future needs. The total area under organic farming continues to increase. It's now estimated to cover at least 14 million hectares of agricultural land, about 8.5% of total EU agricultural land. Let me highlight that the biggest causes of agricultural biodiversity loss are land abandonment and increased intensification, both of which are linked to the economic pressures of farming. It is therefore important that the Common Agricultural Policy not only encourages environmental actions, but also provides a solid basis of economic support, in particular support for small farmers and mixed farms can ensure the diversity of our farmed landscape, will support for young farmers can protect its future. By reducing the economic pressure on farmers, we can reduce the environmental pressure on land, ecosystem, and the planet. As I mentioned, with fighting climate change, food system changes and research and innovation will be key to restoring biodiversity. By encouraging shorter supply chains, local food systems, and demand for more sustainable food, we can bring joint environmental, social, and economic benefits. European Union funded research and innovation, such as the 9 billion euro through Horizon Europe, is helping to provide the farming community with the knowledge, skills, and tools. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Watt, biodiversity ecosystems in Australia. Do you have, again, bad news, good news, and better news?
You're picking up a bit of a theme here. Well, I was thinking actually that I'm not sure how many people in the room have been to Australia, but probably your images of Australia, when you think about it, often involve our landscapes and our biodiversity. So the Great Barrier Reef, our rainforests, Uluru, some of our desert landscapes. So I think Australians are very proud of the biodiversity that we have, and we recognise that it's a real selling point for our country right across the world. But like in a lot of places, it is experiencing increased pressure, and we need to be doing more there. I've seen, that despite the impacts that we're having, the FAO has noted that Australia is second in the world currently for the average annual net gain in forest area. So there are some improvements, but we recognise that we still do need to do a better job on this front. And the way that we've approached this, there's some things that have been happening for a while and some new things that our new government is keen to pursue. Again, as I say, we're very keen to do those sorts of things in partnership with our farming industries. But we have had regulations around land management in Australia and the clearing of trees for a long time, particularly at a state and territory level, to ensure that there's permit-based systems to undertake that kind of clearing and to put some limits around it and ensure that that particular biodiversity is preserved. We've also had a program in Australia called Land Care for about 30 years, and that was a really innovative in its time partnership between government, farmers and environmentalists about working together with government funding to really preserve our land, particularly in agricultural areas. That's, as I say, been operating for over 30 years now in Australia, and it has a community-led volunteer network of over 6,000 groups and 100,000 people working together towards that sort of sustainable land use in Australia. But what we're planning to do, again, as a new government, is to really invest a lot more in this, in land sustainability and preserving biodiversity, along with, as I mentioned previously, trying to bring in some of those market-based mechanisms around biodiversity markets and carbon credit markets to ensure that farmers have even added economic incentives to manage their land in an appropriate manner. In addition to that, we've got new legislation coming in that we're preparing at the moment to underpin a new national nature repair market. And the idea there is to make it easier for companies and others to invest in biodiversity and drive those sorts of improvements. So I guess the approach that we're trying to take, always in partnership with our farming industry and rural communities, is have serious government investment and government-led legislation, but also develop those kind of market mechanisms at the same time, rather than pursuing one or the other. There's a bunch of other things which I could talk about around soil protection, trying to boost organic carbon material in our soils. We're really getting behind precision agriculture to make much more efficient use of fertilisers, pesticides and things like that. And I'm also the Minister for Forestry in Australia as well, and we're making a very big commitment as a new government to expand our plantation forestry estate to meet some of our timber and wood needs in a more sustainable manner, but as Johan was mentioning earlier, at the same time creating carbon sinks to try to extract some of that carbon out of the atmosphere as well. So as I say, we think that Australia is very blessed to have incredible biodiversity, but it is under pressure, there's no doubt about that, and that's why we need to be doing even more, which is what we're planning to do.
Thanks very much indeed. Minister Krivcha, maybe from you a short contribution to what your government does to address pressure on ecosystems and biodiversity in your country.
Well, I would like to start by saying that Albania is, as I mentioned also earlier, is positioned in the Mediterranean. So we have more than 300 days of sun a year. So our vegetables and fruits and beautiful produce get a lot of sun, which is great for the taste. That's why whenever you visit Albania, you are so in awe of the food and I get a lot of comments like, oh, the cucumbers taste here so differently from elsewhere, or the tomatoes taste here so different, and we like that. So we're very rich, we have a very rich biodiversity, flora, fauna, and it's obviously a challenge to keep. My focus in the past 2 years has been to first identify what are the typical products that are not so extensive, or they're not so marketable, and provide them value. So we're identifying this inventory of species, various crops that we don't want to be extinct, preserve, maintain, add value, and possibly put them in a value chain where they can add value also to the farmers that are going to use them. There are a couple of examples. I want to give the example of a particular grape that is called Kalmeti, which is an autochthone variety, which we are very proud about, 500 years old, found in the northern part of Albania, which our farmers have been producing year on year. What we're trying to do is preserve the characteristics, the terroir, protect its origin, so that in the cadastre of the wine it's not mixed with and it's not being extinct. The same way, we're working with our olives varieties in order to add value and also brand these typical products that are very specific to, that have value from our biodiversity, and commercialize them in a way that we don't lose value over the product. I want to also link it with what we're doing in agritourism. Because what we see often, visitors and tourists that are going to explore very deep, remote, rural areas of Albania find a lot of interest in exploring and linking the biodiversity of the agricultural products with the experience, with the culture that they find, with the hospitality. So people more and more want to appreciate food that is unique, that is typical to a territory, with hospitality, with nice conditions. And what we see, I also want to provide the example of how this is becoming more and more an engine for employment and for generating youth in employment in the rural areas, and tying them to agriculture. So it's a magnet for attracting young people to agricultural services and economic diversification.
Thank you. Ecosystems and pressure on them, loss of biodiversity. Personally, I cannot imagine how that could be on the agenda of the World Trade Organization. But maybe you can surprise me, Mr. Pogam.
Well, actually, yes. I would even tell you that this is the heart of our mandate. If you take the textbook of the WTO, takes the statutory agreement which creates us, you have the World Sustainable Development at the top. So this is a major consideration. If you take our agreement on agriculture, all the philosophy of this agreement is to take trade distorting policies and change them into non-trade distorting policies and pro-environmental policies, for instance, for subsidies. And we even have a very evocative language for that, which is not the traffic light kind of language that you find in Germany, but we have what we call amber box. Those are the bad subsidies, and green box, those are the good subsidies. So this is really the philosophy, and also more technical agreements like the so-called sanitary and phytosanitary or technical obstacle to trade. So this is the letter, the spirit, the purpose of the organization are designed to do that. Now, a lot of what our members are doing, and they are what we call technically notifications, they are telling us their trade policies. They are taking a lot of unilateral measures which are related, which are trade measures related to deforestation, climate change, resource management, all environmental goals that is send us. We put that in a database. There are a lot of regional initiatives also designed to improve the traceability and the sustainability of production. What is not happening is that we are not discussing anymore those issues within the WTO because our agricultural negotiations have been stalled for several years. So it's very important today to try to reconcile the mandate and the actual activity of the organization, that we restart those negotiations. We need agricultural ministers to push a little bit and to help us frame those discussions in order to integrate those new challenges of the time.
Thank you. Well, you have surprised.
I hope I surprised you.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Well, with Mr. Pogam's comments and his surprise, I close the panel discussion between the people sitting up here on the podium. But I do not close the session because we have a few minutes for comments and questions from the audience. If you want to say something, please raise your hand and a hostess with a microphone will rush to you, give you the microphone and give you the opportunity to be heard. Once you have been given the word and the microphone, I would be grateful if you could briefly present yourself and if you have a question to tell me and to tell us to whom of these panelists you would like to address that question. Now, do I see a hand? Yes, there is a hand in the background there. Somebody is approaching you, sir, with a microphone from the back. There you go. Go ahead.
شكرا أنا
Thank you very much indeed.
هذا الملتقى منتدى جيد بالنسبة لنا.
Just a second. We need to get headsets to understand what you say.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a second. Could we have 2 more headsets, please? Dankeschön. Anna. Just a moment, I have to assemble mine. Bitte? I'm just informed that there is no Arabic available. I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I was convinced of the contrary. Oh, there is Arabic. What do you tell me? What do you tell me? So, just a moment. I have to switch this bloody thing on. Okay, ready to go. Shoot.
I am from Mauritania, and I am delighted to be here today joining this international forum. And I would like to mention that in my country, in our country, we have a number of agricultural resources, such as fertile land and areas, and of course we have water. I was very pleased by this discussion, and I want to ask one question. In the global south, we have the expectation that this forum will contribute to solving these issues that are particularly pressing for us in the global south, especially regarding autonomy, regarding sovereignty regarding certain foodstuffs. Let me just mention rice, for instance. We have already reached a sovereignty of 90% by having subsidies for farmers that we paid out, especially also with regard to fertilizers. We have seen the impact of the tremendous rise in prices of the global market due to the war in Ukraine. I should also like to mention the hot climate that we have in our country. And we have nonetheless been successful in adapting to it. We have greenhouse gas technologies that we have implemented and we use them very successfully. So my question would be, what can I take back to my country, to our countries in this area? Regarding the support coming from this forum, the support coming from experts, companies, businesses, entrepreneurs, opportunities for investment maybe in the global south, countries of the global south. There are significant resources in agriculture, so we could make a positive contribution to making progress on our plan.
Thank you. Thank you. The question of what you can take back from this forum, how investments could work in your country and in countries comparable to yours. Maybe Jo Svinnen would have an idea what to say.
I must say I couldn't follow the question because the
You couldn't follow the question. Indeed, we had your voice extremely loud in monitors behind us. But the other panelists, any idea what we could tell the gentleman?
Well, thank you, moderators. A very basic one. I think climate change is really the game changer that we have been discussing about in all agricultural policies. For the bad, because it's impacting negatively agricultural productivity, but also maybe for opportunities. One of them is to improve carbon sequestration. So is there some ways that, from a trade perspective, the discussions one day would offer new opportunities to developing countries in terms of investment, in terms of possibility of making money with the carbon sequestration schemes? That is a topic that I submit to the thinking of the gentleman.
Mr. Watt? I
was just going to add to that certainly the trade issues, and I've obviously made the point about how Australia feels about those issues, and the impact of subsidies, as short-term as they may be beneficial, in the longer term provide real problems for food security. But I think that the opportunity for all of us, no matter where we've come from, to share the experiences and what's working in our own countries is a really valuable one that we can take home. I mean, I've obviously come partly to this conference to share some of the things that Australia's doing, but I want to take home some lessons from all of you about what might apply back in my country, and perhaps there's things that you've heard from us today that might work in your country, but at the same time, I think also getting an understanding that one size doesn't fit all, and I suspect that the way we might do sustainable agriculture in Australia might not work in your country, and what you do might not work in mine, but there's probably something we can learn from each other, and even understanding that different approaches might need to be taken to get to the same goal is a good thing.
Thank you very much for these two contributions. We do not have massive time left, but two more questions. Yes, madam, over there. The lady in the one to the fourth row. No. In the fourth row, here.
Madam of the fourth row, Rose O'Donovan, Agrifax, Editor-in-Chief in Brussels. Commissioner, a question, if I may. You mentioned the idea of the introduction of risk management tools, perhaps better risk management tools for European farmers to better deal with crisis situations and handle these shocks due to climate events, etc., on the basis of this discussion. What sort of instruments, specific instruments, do you have in mind going forward looking at the Common Agricultural Policy post-2027? So that's one question for you to ponder on. Minister Watt, you certainly made a very clear case there for free and open trade. My question to you, and perhaps also the Commissioner for Agriculture from the European Union, the EU-Australia trade deal, when can we, I understand that negotiations are gathering pace, when can we expect a deal to be completed? Is this something that you would like to see done before the summer holidays, or at least by the end of the year? So there are my two questions. Thank you, Peter, for moderating.
Normally you were only entitled to one question.
Okay, I'll take the prerogative there.
All right.
Commissioner,
would you like to address the risk management?
Thank you very much. Maybe very briefly to the previous question, to this for Mr. from Mauritania. That's I like to say that each effort to reduce CO2 emissions, that the restrictive climate and environmental policy which our farmers participate, there is also action for Africa also, that the climate we have one climate for our planet, and this is action, this is contribution of our farmers to improve the climate condition in the whole planet. But also especially for Africa, there are programs financed, supported by the European Union. There's this task force, European Union, African countries. We have permanent contacts with African Commission. Once a year there is a common meeting with European Commission and African Commission, that we cooperate very intensively with African countries to solve this problem. About the crisis instruments, no, the first is the crisis reserve. We have the crisis reserve in the Common Agricultural Policy, which is now 500 million euro, which is for the 27 member states, for the 9 million farmers, for the 160 million hectares of agricultural land, which is about the €3 per hectare. No, this is not. We used reserve, of course, it was helpful for the farmer, but in such accumulation of the crisis phenomena that it is not enough. And to strengthen the crisis reserve and to this is the first issue, that not such often to go to say to member states, please use the state aid. As I said, no. We have common agricultural policy. We should have stronger instrument for crisis management at the European level. This is my answer for this question.
Okay. Minister Watt?
Thank you. The short answer to your question, when we would hope to arrive at a FTA with the EU, is by the middle of this year. We're conscious that the European parliamentary elections are in the second half of this year, and we would obviously like to see the agreement reached as quickly as possible. The Commissioner has been very gracious with his time here with me and with other representatives of the Australian government, and we're working through that. The Commissioner and other European countries know that Australia is very keen to sign an FTA with the EU. We obviously need to be able to have really meaningful market access for our producers to be able to demonstrate that this is a deal worth doing. We can't settle for any deal. There's got to be something good in it for Australian producers. But equally, we recognise that there are sensitivities for both the EU and for Australia that we need to work through. But we've tried to take a pretty pragmatic approach to this deal, not going in with ridiculous asks, we think, in the interest of trying to get to a deal as quickly as we possibly can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We're really running out of time because the room will be used by another event in a short period of time. But one last short question with a short answer from this gentleman.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I am Rizal. I am from Indonesia, represent from Young Farmer Port in GFFA. Thank you for the explanation. My question, you are mentioned that agriculture is causing become deforestation, and in another hands, no more people they want to doing in agriculture. For example, particularly in youth generation. So I want to ask particularly to Minister from Australia and Albania, do you have specific not only concept but also the grand design, very amazing design with a solution for attract new youth people for interesting come back maybe and consent in agriculture sector, because that is the big issue for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So, Minister Kivcha, attracting new people.
Very sure, very sure. We have a University of Agriculture in Albania, very big. I go there once a month and I have a topic and I discuss with young people in the university about certain issues of agriculture, whatever they want to discuss, in order to keep the public debate going. This is one. Second, in our policy measures, we address investments for young people specifically. We give them better grants, so higher amounts of grants. We give them a priority for people under 40. And the third one is we've seen a tremendous attraction in farm diversification. So they need to see that there is more potential of using agriculture also for added value in other economic activity. Agritourism agrotourism is one. The average age of people that are currently leading agrotourism activities in the country is 35 years old. They're employing around 20 people for each agrotourism. They are working for more than 50 farms around their locations. So I think these three elements are core to my activity with attracting young people.
Okay.
Just very briefly, there's a number of things we're trying to do, from reducing the cost of educational courses for careers in agriculture, a range of other things, but probably the main thing we're trying to do, and again it's in partnership with our farming industry in Australia, is changing the image of farming in Australia. Because I think in Australia, I heard what the Commissioner said, most people's image of a farmer is probably someone a bit like me, an old guy, and increasingly old. But in fact, there's such exciting careers available in agriculture these days. And one of the high schools in my city, I live in the capital city of one of our states. It's an urban environment, but some of the schools have agriculture programs. And the two things that are attracting 15 and 16-year-olds to undertake careers in agriculture that it's a high-tech industry, increasingly, so it's an exciting, technologically driven industry, and secondly, that it's a sustainable industry. And that's where getting this sustainability stuff right in agriculture is not just good for the environment, it's not just good for farmers, but it's a really great way, because so many young people want to work in a sustainable industry, and agriculture should be number one.
Ladies and gentlemen, have you liked this high-level panel? I have. So I do think that the panelists, our host, and Professor Swinnan have truly merited that round of applause. But we shall not forget to say thank you before we leave to the interpreters for their excellent job. And to the brilliant technical staff in the back of the room, without whom this event could not have happened. This is all from our side, from my side. Keep well, keep safe, goodbye, and see you hopefully next year. Goodbye.